Welcome back to DM Gives Inspiration, and the final episode of Season 8, a Mailbag episode. These questions came to me via the contact link over at kylefergusson.com and through the Discord or Twitter, which you can find links to on that website. The first question is from Jeff, who recently started a 5th edition campaign. As we get acclimated to the game, questions have arisen regarding the impact of stats on role-playing. For example, can a character with high charisma be a jerk? I feel like high charisma implies likability, whether that likability is genuine, good, or a facade to manipulate others, evil. If a player seems to be role-playing too far away from their stats, what is the best way to handle that? A great question. One that certainly pertains more to the intelligence, wisdom, and charisma stats. A character playing outside their means for strength, dexterity, or constitution will easily find themselves countered in situations. What are they going to do? Brag about how much poison they can drink and then get horribly sick? Say, watch me climb this wall, watch me cross this balance beam and then mess it up? The roles will easily counter any sort of role-playing they're doing, and we can simply pass it off as lying. But most characters have a dump stat, whether they have rolled their stats or they're using a standard array or point buy. One of their main attributes is likely to be in that 10 to 8 range. Pretty bad, but not monstrously bad. A giant spider has an intelligence of 2, a -4 modifier, and a charisma of 4, a -3 modifier. There is no way for a player to have that bad of stats using a standard roll system. There is no rule or class feature in Dungeons & Dragons that says a player can't read based on their intelligence or wisdom. Being unable to read would just be a character choice. But you're not wrong that players sometimes act outside of their character's stats, particularly when it comes to the player's personality. For first-time players, it's always good to encourage them to play something very close to themselves, so they don't have to micromanage their own play. Experienced players, particularly the gamer types, like to try all the classes, and don't really make a determined effort to roleplay differently given their stats each time. They can also bring a lot of metagame knowledge to your table that you might not want, such as calling out the AC of a creature or warning people about special monster attacks that their character would have no knowledge of yet. In those sort of cases, if you have a puzzle-loving player who has decided to play a low wisdom intelligence barbarian, maybe the character was even sold to you as a I'm going to smash things barbarian, and instead you got a Sherlock Holmes wearing a loincloth, that's absolutely something you should point out. Though it's probably better to go about it in a different way that advances their character rather than limits it. So for instance, bring up their backstory. Why is Joe Dash so interested in the library? This is kind of that yes and practice. We're giving the player a chance to expand their character rather than limit it. Maybe they could now add in a part where a traveling merchant came by with a lot of books in their youth and they were fascinated by it. Maybe they learned to read from that merchant and they kind of have a side quest to find that merchant someday as a sort of father figure. In this case, a love of books or a desire to read doesn't counteract the fact that they will fail on a lot of their intelligence saves versus certain spells. They may not be book smart, though they can still be worldly. They might have intimate knowledge about their craft, even amazing strategical knowledge, which could manifest in the player's portrayal of their character as naive or trusting. That's again asking them to portray their character correctly based on their stats. I would still suggest avoiding calling out their stats for as long as possible. If you must limit a character's intelligence in a certain situation, make them roll an investigation check instead. They said something particularly profound. Solve the puzzle in a way that doesn't match their barbarian. Maybe an investigation check, much like a persuasion check, would highlight the delivery of that information in their character's voice. Just like a shy player playing a bard, you didn't make them do the actual speech. They just rolled a persuasion, and we sort of imagine the trappings on top of it. They get their request made. In this case, we're denying their request because their intelligence is too low to have figured out what their player put together. A little bit harder to do in the investigation department with intelligence, particularly involving things like riddles, where the human, sitting in the room with you, knows the answer to the puzzle. In that case, we're asking them to be kind to the others and not ruin the puzzle for those who are currently enjoying it. This sort of ask for a role thing works way better with insight, because you can tell the player what their character perceives. I think this guy is lying to us, says the barbarian player. Well, make them roll an insight. Give them something that's based on their character in that instance. You're not sure if they're lying to you, but they do have a habit of holding up their palms in front of them in a sort of stop motion. Showing your palms in your culture is very, very abrasive. And your barbarian takes note of this. Maybe a ridiculous example, but this is that yes and. We're giving the player more to work with. And hopefully the fun of that situation will limit their activities. But let's talk about charisma. Charisma has no impact on your physical appearance. It has no impact on your likability. It does increase the chance that you can turn on the charm, or lie really well, make a good first impression. But walking in a room, a player's charisma may not be immediately known. The handsome elf might be bad at charisma, having no need for the stat. The gruff dwarf might actually be a cunning linguist. If the players enter a tavern with weapons drawn, with a slain monster over their shoulders, or are pursued by bandits who make a mess of the place, there's no reason why the tavern owner wouldn't react to that information first. Their amazing charisma score may not immediately be known in that situation. Their first impression would be bad, regardless of their ability later to speak their way out of it. A character with high charisma score might also be shy, forgettable, or just a fish out of water, like is the case with many warlocks. Warlocks often have amazing charisma. However, they're also kind of weirdos. So to answer your question, can a character with high charisma be a jerk? Think of Dr. Peter Venkman from Ghostbusters. He can turn on the charm, convince a room to give him what he wants, but we might also call him a lovable arse. In this sort of case, there'd be nothing wrong with your NPC saying, "You're kind of a jerk, but you make a good point." And that's where the stats would reinforce the character. If in your particular game you have a player who is always getting themselves into trouble and then trying to charisma their way out of it, there needs to be actionable punishment when those dice rolls go bad. They get thrown in jail for the night, they get kicked out of the tavern, they aren't allowed at future meetings with the king. And while this wasn't part of your question, there's no reason the leader of your party can't be a low intelligence, low wisdom, low charisma character. Just think of Luke Skywalker. A rather unremarkable fellow. Not particularly likable, a little whiny. Even later on with Jedi mind tricks, he doesn't exactly get his way. But his decisions, the portrayal of the character, make him a hero. Singing Takuya asks, how do you know who to play with? I've been a 5th edition DM for close to 4 years, with groups composed of both real-life friends and internet friends, as well as strangers. Most experiences were good. However, seemingly regardless of whoever I play with, friends or strangers, I have continual issues, especially with groups falling apart and problem players. Is there anything I can do to stop this cycle? I'll answer your question directly, and then I'll get to what I inferred from your question. D&D is a cooperative storytelling team-based game. Ball hogs, show-offs, wild cards, tricksters can all be managed if put in their appropriate roles. Ball hogs on damage dealers, show-offs on bards, wild cards on warlocks and spellcasters, and tricksters on the rogues. Players playing to their type makes things a lot easier because then you can treat the character the way you treat the player in your game. You can do things like seating charts, or even a ball or stick that you have to be holding in order to talk, so that only one person can talk at a time. When playing digitally, this might be the talking box, a part of the map that you have designated. If the miniature is in there, you're now the one talking. When building your group, you're actively managing these types. And we might call the ball hogs, show-off, wild cards, and tricksters the wacky players. But you're also managing the amount of slow players you have at your table. Poor time management players. Think about your experience with those players and label them harshly. Do they take forever to pick their character in Super Smash Bros? Does their turn in Settlers of Catan Night always take too long? You might not want to have too many of those players at your table, or the imagination, the theater of the mind, will fall apart just because of the downtime between actions. We all have a lot of really, really good friends who are bad at time management. We like to think of these as our sort of sitcom friends. They're often late, they show up when they want to. You never really know if they're going to show up to a gathering, but that's kind of the fun of them. It's just fun to have them around, and their presence is always a surprise. They're not that great for D&D, though. You can maybe have one. This would be your Gandalf type, who comes and goes as they please. It can be easy to balance around one incidental player, but not two, not three, not a whole party. And that's where the cuts get really, really hard. Sometimes your best friends aren't good fits for D&D. Maybe it's just these bad or unpredictable schedules they have. Maybe they easily burn out on games. They have a lack of focus. They might make great guest players at your table. They want to experience D&D, but they don't necessarily want to sign up for it. Think about your history with them. Maybe an MMO you all played. We're all gonna do this expansion of World of Warcraft. We're all gonna be there. But they flaked out. They burned out. There are, of course, tons of exceptions, and that comes down to respect for the game. For a lot of us, D&D is a very special game. It is an escape. It is a creative outlet. And that's something you need to be very strong about in that session 0. How important this game is to you. It's cheesy. It is. It's cheesy to sit there and say that this game means a lot. Maybe to people who you don't even know that well. But it's an important starting point. Every DM is going to have their own rule set for players based on their experiences. Some say no significant others ever at the table. That seems a little harsh. But in a game in high school, college, that can make sense. Maybe players are in and out of relationships all the time, and it's very difficult for the DM to manage that group, those changing characters. Maybe it's invited drama in the past. It's so easy as DM to think you're managing the roles. All right, I got a tank, a DPS, and a healer. Now I'm good to add whoever I want to this table. But your paladin won't necessarily tank. And their own personality, the player's personality, is going to have a grander impact on your table than their actual class selection. So you will have to be brutal. Telling that friend with the wishy-washy schedule that they can't join your D&D game starting up tomorrow sucks. But in your heart, I'm sure you know that they're going to miss too many games and it's going to be an issue. Even in character creation, it's not too late. You might be getting some red flags that this goofball is going to mess up your game. That's where this game matters a lot to me. This is a serious game. A team-based game can really come in. If they say, I'm just looking to have fun, no problem, this table isn't for you. But we might play a wackier game in the future, and I think you would enjoy that one. If this was your problem, then you already know the players you would like to cut. It might just be too late to do it in a stylish way. In which case, don't treat your current campaign as anything too sacred. You can always start a new one. Do your best to end the campaign as it currently is. And don't ghost the person you don't want at your table, but just start up the new game with the set of players that you would enjoy most. Now to what I inferred, this all could be just based on your campaigns are too long. You might want a really epic Lord of the Rings 3-year campaign. So you pick out a challenge rating 20 monster for your big bad, and you're gonna go from level 1. Lives change, schedules change. Maybe we can just get the ring to Rivendell. The players don't even know what they're missing. They didn't know about your plans for Mordor. Things falling apart might just be due to a campaign going over 6 months. Regardless if it's perfect, if it never loses the thread, if it never gets muddled, life happens. And players can't be expected to predict more than 6 months out in the future. Great question. Be sure to check out Season 1, Episode 2, the second episode I ever did, Problem Players, for more talk on this sort of thing, even though the editing might be a little rough in those early seasons. Let's end with 2 shorter questions here. Gunter9 asks, How do you feel about a level 3 conjuration spell potentially doing 48d6 damage? The spell is Conjure Animals, which has a range of 60 feet. If the player summons a cow 60 feet above their enemy and drops it on them, the fall damage would be substantial. And this is very true and very ridiculous. That the creature can be summoned up to 60 feet out. After summoned, the creature can leave that 60-foot range. Since a cow is a challenge rating 1/4, you could have 8 cows summoned. I would be very quick to nip this in the bud. Summoning meteoric cows was not the intent of the developers when they made the Conjure Animal spell. Rules as written, it is possible, though I'd have a little extra pushback against the player because I doubt they came up with this themselves. This is a rather popular internet tale of how to break the game, very much along the lines of Mold Earth is the most powerful spell in the game. If pressed, we could do rules as intended. It says, each beast is considered fey, and it disappears when it drops to 0 hit points or when the spell ends. As a DM facing down this argument, I could say, well, since it hits the ground and instantly loses all its hit points, it doesn't explode or deal that damage to the character it hits, but still a little bit of a stretch. Ultimately, this is a very evil and grotesque act, sending cows to their doom in this way. If they don't disappear, it would be a very meaty demise. 8 cows exploding on impact isn't exactly something I want to describe frequently at my table. Ultimately, we'd have to talk about the character's alignment a bit, if they want to perform this with any regularity at all, even just once. This is also a druid or ranger spell, and particularly in the druid's case, I'd have to ask, how is this giving balance to nature? If I was running a particularly wacky table and I allowed this, I would also have the King of the Cow dimension show up and attack this player eventually, as their subjects are being teleported to the material plane and used as explosives on impact. Rishi asks our final question. Dear DM, I'm wondering your thoughts on if there is a certain must-considered every party should think about for their composition, having a tank, healer, support, etc. Is it the responsibility of balance on the DM to tailor the action to the party's composition? Yes, but there are limitations on how hard the DM should be expected to work around the party's ridiculous composition. 3 wizards can be a very, very fun group. The DM would be expected to control themselves and not throw spell-resistant monsters around every corner. However, if you tell your players we're doing Curse of Strahd, and none of them pick Radiant spells or Radiant classes, and they go with a rather poor group design, the DM would be in their right to make them fail that adventure. It is a pre-made adventure that has certain difficulties and challenges. And in the case of Curse of Strahd, building a very certain party can make that a whole lot easier. In a more custom campaign, the DM should slowly feel things out. Give the players a challenge that is appropriate to their level and their playstyle. Our 3 wizards example will have huge damage throughput, but shouldn't be expected to do more than 3 big fights in a single day. They simply won't have the spells to function in that regard. A party with 3 healers won't have very good damage output, and they should have a very different set of challenges to face. So ultimately, my answer is, do the Holy Trinity if you're new to D&D. If you're a first-time DM, have a declared tank, DPS, and healer support. After that, it can be very, very interesting and fun to branch out, particularly with groups with many spellcasters. That can be really, really fun and a cool challenge as DM. Thank you for listening to today's episode, and thank you for joining me for Season 8 of DM Gives Inspiration. This show will return for a Season 9. Expect Season 9 around the start of August. The show is supported by the patrons over at patreon.com/Kyle Fergusson. 2 S's in Fergusson. Music was by Brian Griffith. One of the great things about this show is the back catalog is timeless. Help out the show by sharing it however you can. Send particular episodes to your friends who might need the advice. Like and subscribe on whatever podcast catcher you're using. Good luck at your tables, and I'll see you soon for that Season 9.